I'd like to turn now to NourbeSe Philip and introduce her. We are really, really delighted that she was able to come to be part of this series about how our reading impacts our lives and calls to us and informs our thinking and our relationship to, if you like, the world. NourbeSe is an acclaimed poet, writer, and also lawyer who was born in Tobago and now lives in Toronto. She writes both fiction and non-fiction and has published 5 books of poetry, including Thorns, 1980, Salmon Courage, 83, She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks, 1988, and Zong, 2008. And also 2 novels, Harriet's Daughter, also in 1988, and Looking for Livingston, An Odyssey of Silence. She's also published essays and plays. She Tries Her Tongue won the prestigious Casa de las Americas Prize while still in manuscript form, and she's received numerous fellowships and awards for her work, among them a Guggenheim Fellowship, a MacDowell Fellowship, and the Chalmers Fellowship in Poetry. So NourbeSe, can I hand over to you now and welcome you very warmly to today.
First, thank you to all of you for being here, having me here in this beautiful city. I spent this morning walking around looking at the, what did Hardy say, the dreaming spires of Oxford. Thanks to Elleke, Marina, and Matthew. My apologies, we just met. So what I think I'll do is read a short bit. You can signal to me when I should shut up. Because I've been told since I'm the featured person, I have a little bit more time. But as we talked before coming in, I had a few ideas as to how I should do this. I'm going to read from the title essay in this work called A Genealogy of Resistance. This particular, the publishing house is no longer in existence, and this is now out of print. I have some copies at home, but it will be in print again this year through Wesleyan in the US. The title essay, A Genealogy of Resistance. And any French-speaking people, forgive my accent, there are 3 epigraphs, the first one is in French. Et c'est l'heure, ô poète, de décliner ton nom, ta naissance et ta race. And the time has come, O poet, to declare your name, your birth, and your race. That's from St. John Perse, from Exile. A poet whose work has meant a lot to me in my development. The second is from Jean-Paul Sartre. The writer has a place in his age. Each word has an echo, as does each silence. And the third is from an African-American poet. Some of you may know her, Audre Lorde, the late Audre Lorde. The white fathers told us, I think, therefore I am. And the black mother within each of us, the poet, whispers in our dreams, I feel, therefore I can be free. Please come in. Poetry coins the language to express and chart this revolutionary demand. As I said, from Audre Lorde. And there's an essay in here in which I actually mentioned this for the longest while, and it still surfaces. I had this sense of 2 people standing over my shoulder when I wrote. One was John from Sussex, and one was a Bissois. And there was always this fight going on as to, when I wrote, who should be in control. This quote from Audrey that I have just read just brought it to mind. I'll just read a few paragraphs from the beginning. I will begin with him, not with the word, which was in the beginning. I shall speak of him who every evening with slow and careful hands brought light to displace the darkness. Mesmerized, I watched the delicate bag of white gauze fill, glow bright white under the slow and steady pumping. The light grows stronger and brighter until its harsh glare has chased away the encroaching blackness. Where was it kept during the day? The kerosene lantern. What color was it? The only memory is of that daily ritual, my father bringing light to the home. A house perched on the seashore, on the coast of a tiny island, Tobago, in an even tinier village, a fishing village with an impressive name, Plymouth, named no doubt for that much larger, busier Plymouth, so many thousands of miles away. A genealogy of names, Plymouth, Scarborough, Les Coteaux, Lans-Fourmi, having everything to do with those who in their brutal naming obliterated others, names and people. I will begin there with a kerosene lantern. No, with him, my father, bringing light, because the image lingers long in my mind. So much light from one small and fragile bag. I begin with him not because there's any more reason to begin with him, my father, than with her, my mother. I begin with him because one needs a place to begin, a place from which to build a genealogy. And beginning with him and the lamp and the light appears so much clearer. Besides, the images I associate with her, but those come later in the stories and poems. How they proliferate, the stories, each a tiny filigreed net, like the mantle of the kerosene lantern. My father pursuing his own spored trail, part hope, part memory, in the construction of a genealogy. Of what? Belonging? Last born of 10 children, weighted with a name solid enough to balance his ambition. He takes early retirement from a teaching profession and goes to England, the mother country, to become a lawyer, does not become a lawyer, does research, becomes obsessed with the island of his birth, Tobago. I'll end there because I think he passed on that obsession to me, the island, Tobago. And as I said to Marina last week, it's the place I write from, though not necessarily about. In fact, I was reading in The Guardian this weekend, the Irish writer who just wrote that entire novel, One Sentence, talks about this little town he was from and how that shapes his life. And that's the role that Tobago plays in my life. Although I only lived there for 8 years, my father moved us to Trinidad, but somehow those 8 years are the most formative. As Elleke mentioned, I left home, studied, became a lawyer, practiced law for 7 years, although I knew I was not going to remain forever. I think I was finishing his business. He didn't want me, it wasn't that I felt he wanted me to become a lawyer, but I think in families that happens. Children are very intuitive and sometimes take on burdens that are not theirs. But it served me in good stead because I think without it I couldn't have written Zong, although I had to have left it to have written Zong. So that's the Zen koan-like situation. I would like to read a bit from, so I wrote 2 books when I was practicing law, Thorns and Salmon Courage. And then there's a break, and this book comes. She tries her tongue, her silence softly breaks. And interestingly enough, this morning at breakfast, I was talking to a young woman who is from Australia, who's here at one of the conferences, and she has done work on Greek dramas, and she was talking about Io, and I said, oh, but she gave the title to this book. So it's interesting, these synchronicities. She tries her tongue, her silence softly breaks. So what is interesting is that the first half of this book, the poems are still very much within the tradition of the lyric form, and I was really struggling with that. And the second half of the book represents this break, the center poem, I think beginning with Meditations on the Declension of Beauty by the girl with the flying cheekbones, which maybe I'll read. Meditations on the Declension of Beauty by the girl with the flying cheekbones. If not, if not, if not. If not in yours, in whose? In whose language am I? If not in yours, in whose? In whose language am I am? If not in yours, in whose am I? If not in yours, I am yours. In whose language am I not? Am I not? I am yours. If not in yours, if not in yours, in whose language am I? Girl with the flying cheekbones, she is, I am. Woman with the behind that drives men mad. And if not in yours, where is the woman with a nose broad as her strength? If not in yours, in whose language is the man with the full moon lips, carrying the midnight of color, split by the stars, a smile, if not in yours? In whose language am I? Am I not? Am I am yours. Am I not? I am yours. Am I am. If not in yours, in whose language am I? If not in yours, beautiful. So I think that's the transition poem, actually, because the next poem is Discourse on the Logic of Language. But what I want to say there is you can see the struggle in that poem trying to work with metaphors and those images that are part of language, but that speak to our non-being, that speak to, as I read this poem, I just remembered there's a line there that says, where's the woman with a nose broad as her strength? And it brings to mind something, some of you may have noticed this, the decision that recently came down around the African-American man who was shot by the police, and the decision just found the police officer not guilty. One of the things that he said, the police officer, was that the man that he observed had a broad nose. And again, this is something that is very much part of how we came into this language, which I say I love. It's my mother tongue, as you'll see in the following poem. But it has always interested me that, I'm sure many of you know that Celan, after the Second World War, questioned German as a language to write in. It had been so contaminated by what had happened in World War II. And it's always interested me that has never been much of an issue for those of us who inhabit English, like talking about the contamination of the language from these historical tragic events. But that poem is this struggle of trying to find a language in which to consider myself, so to speak. The next one I'll read is Discourse on the Logic of Language. And this, I think, that one was the transition. This is the watershed poem, I think.
It's also on the handouts, on one of the sides.
With the various little sections. Discourse on the Logic of Language. English is my mother tongue. A mother tongue is not a foreign language, languish, anguish, a foreign anguish. English is my father tongue. A father tongue is a foreign language. Therefore, English is a foreign language, not a mother tongue. What is my mother tongue? My mammy tongue, my mummy tongue, my momsy tongue, my mode tongue, my ma tongue. I have no mother tongue, no mother to tongue, no tongue to mother tongue me. I must therefore be tongue dumb, dumb tongued, dub tongued, damn dumb tongue. When it was born, the mother held her newborn child close. She began then to lick it all over. The child whimpered a little, but as the mother's tongue moved faster and stronger over its body, it grew silent, the mother turning it this way and that under her tongue until she had tongued it clean of the creamy white substance covering its body. Edict 1. Every owner of slaves shall, wherever possible, ensure that his slaves belong to as many ethno-linguistic groups as possible. If they cannot speak to each other, they cannot then foment rebellion and revolution. Those parts of the brain chiefly responsible for speech are named after the two learned 19th century doctors, the eponymous doctors Wernicke and Broca, respectively. Dr. Broca believed the size of the brain determined intelligence. He devoted much of his time to proving that white males of the Caucasian race had larger brains than, and were therefore superior to women, blacks, and other peoples of color. Understanding and recognition of the spoken word takes place in Wernicke's area, the left temporal lobe, situated next to the auditory cortex. From there, relevant information passes to Broca's area, situated in the left frontal cortex, which then forms the response and passes it on to the motor cortex. The motor cortex controls the muscles of speech. But I have a dumb tongue, dumb, father tongue, and English is my mother tongue, is my father tongue, is a foreign language, anguish, a foreign anguish is English, another tongue, my mother, mammy, mummy, moder, mater, meser, moder, tongue. Mother tongue, mother, tongue me, mother me, touch me with the tongue of your language, anguish, English is a foreign language. The mother then put her fingers into her child's mouth, gently forcing it open. She touches her tongue to the child's tongue, and holding the tiny mouth open, she blows into it hard. She was blowing words, her mother's words, those of her mother's mother, and all their mothers before, into her daughter's mouth. Edict 2, every slave caught speaking his native language shall be severely punished. Where necessary, removal of the tongue is recommended. The offending organ, when removed, should be hung on high in a central place, so that all may see and tremble. A tapering, blunt-tipped, muscular, soft and fleshy organ describes A, the penis, B, the tongue, C, neither of the above, D, both of the above. In man, the tongue is A, the principal organ of taste, B, the principal organ of articulate speech, C, the principal organ of oppression and exploitation, D, all of the above. The tongue, A, is an interwoven bundle of striated muscle running in 3 planes. B is fixed to the jawbone. C has an outer covering of a mucous membrane covered with papillae. D contains 10,000 taste buds, none of which are sensitive to the taste of foreign words. Air is forced out of the lungs up the throat to the larynx, where it causes the vocal cords to vibrate and create sound. The metamorphosis from sound to intelligible word requires A, the lip, tongue, and jaw all working together. B, a mother tongue. C, the overseer's whip. D, all of the above, or none. But I have a dumb tongue, dumb father tongue, and English is my mother tongue, is my father tongue, is a foreign language, anguish, a foreign anguish is English, another tongue, my mother, mammy, mummy, moder, mater, meser, moder, tongue, mother tongue. Tongue, mother tongue me, mother tongue me, mother me, touch me with the tongue of your language, anguish. English is a foreign anguish. I apologize for the coughing, quite unexpected. So I'll just quickly sort of give an idea of where I went after this. Elleke mentioned Looking for Livingstone as one of my novels. I always understood this to be a poem in prose and poetry. The publisher decided to market it as a novel. At the end of this work, She Tries Her Tongue, I was confronted with the idea of silence. And so this is a narrative poem. An unnamed traveler sets out to find the source of her silence. And then she decides that Livingstone embodies her silence. And she goes to all these various villages whose names are all anagrams of silence. So she goes to the Eknelis and the Skenile and the Cecilians and so on. And I'll just read very quickly from that, just to give a sense. And in fact, I was amused this morning because well, no, I won't tell you that now. I'll just read very quickly from this and then tell you what I was going to tell you. I want to read something called The Museum of Silence. Just bear with me a second. The Museum of Silence. I won't read the whole thing. 7 billion years. The traveler travels for the age of the universe, and then she meets Livingstone in a forest. 7 billion years, that's how long I had been traveling. I had seen many, many strange things, been witness to even stranger events, but the strangest of all was the Museum of Silence, erected to house the many and varied silences of different peoples, the Skenile, the Lenseki, the Eknelis, the Niskli, the Klinis, and the Niklis, and many, many others. Their silences were all there. As I wandered throughout this museum, I recognized many of the displays. These silences were mine as much as they had belonged to the people they had been taken from. Return them, I demanded of the proprietors. You must return these silences to their owners. Without their silence, these people are less than whole. They smiled and said nothing. It had been theft originally, I continued. Now it was nothing but intimidation, plain and simple, extortion to continue to hold the entire store of our silence ransom, demand we pay for it, and give assurances we would care for it as they had. And just a very small lyric type poem. How pause the punish in silence, noun, verb, absent a grammar. How surrender to within that without remains. Silence demands the break, the die, in release, in life. And at the end of the work, it's sort of meta text. What I say at the end here is author's note. A record of the documents and records of the traveler which form the basis of this work abound in 2 volumes and on deposit at the Bodleian Library, Oxford University. The leather-bound books are burgundy-colored, hand-sewn, and of legal size, 8.5 by 14 inches. Embossed in gold, in the center of each cover are the words "Diary of a Traveler." And it goes on to describe the book, and these words are repeated on the flyleaf in a round, strong hand in an ink which is quite faded. Also on each cover, some 2 inches above the lower edge, and also embossed in gold are the words Volume 1 and Volume 2. And it just describes all the maps in the books are hand-drawn, and while some appear crude, many are well-executed, being fanciful and delicately covered. The chief librarian and archivist at the Bodleian Library believes this to be the original manuscript of the Diary of a Traveler and the only extant copy. However, on the last page of Volume 2, in the same round hand that appears throughout the volume, appears the following statement. This is but a facsimile of my odyssey into silence. The original diaries, including maps of these travels, were given to the Cecilians for safekeeping, since they were the only ones who kept their silence. The exact location of the diaries is unknown, but I believe the Cecilians have buried them in an unmarked spot. A brief note on the display case containing these volumes states, contrary to the statement on the last page of Volume 2, these volumes comprise the only and original copy of the Diary of a Traveler, William D. Boyd, Chief Archivist and Librarian, and Tim Gill, who wrote a wonderful book on Livingstone. His work was very helpful in doing that. And so now I'll just talk very quickly about how I came to Zong As I said, I practiced law, and after 7 years, gave up the practice for poetry. Law and poetry both share a hyper concern with language, something I only realized after, a comma, a single mark of punctuation, as happened in the States recently, a few months ago, you're nodding, could save you millions of dollars, can bring you awards, can mean that you should be killed. So there's this hyper concern with language, which both disciplines share. I have written about this, unpublished, about where they come together and where they actually stray from each other. I first read about the Zong case in a work by one of your English academics, James Walvin, and it really shocked me when I read it. He described it as being one of the strangest cases in English history around the slave trade. And I made a note because he actually gave the legal citation for the work. And I thought, I should go and look that up at some point, which I did some years after. And I was horrified, shocked, when I got to the library, the law library, found the report in one of the usual case report books. It was just 2 pages. And I thought to myself, how is it possible that there are only 2 pages related to an incident in which over 150 people were killed? That report is the only extant document related to Zong. And what it is, it's Lord Mansfield's judgment giving the insurers a new trial. And I'll just back up from there. So the ship is coming across the Atlantic. Some people fall ill and die, some of the enslaved Africans as well. The captain decides he will throw a certain number of them overboard. He was inexperienced. The journey also takes a lot longer than usual. When the ship eventually gets back to Liverpool, the reason he throws them overboard is because the law as it existed then allowed for you to collect insurance monies if you had to reduce your losses. So he felt he was doing the owners of the ship a favor by killing these people. And true to pattern, when they get back to Liverpool after stopping in Jamaica with what was left of the 470 Africans that comprised the cargo, the owners, the Gregsons, make a claim for insurance monies. The insurance company refuses to pay them, and the insurance company then appeals that decision, and that is the decision that is reported, in which Mansfield gives the insurance company the right to a new trial. My understanding is, based on research, that there never was a new trial, and the trail goes cold. The event is used by many of the abolitionists here to, garner support for the abolitionist movement and so on, as some of you and many of you know. I photocopied the 2 pages of the decision and took it home, because I understood, having studied law, that what you spend most of your time doing is reading cases. And you're reading cases often as they go through a process. By the time it gets to the appeal level, most of the messy human part of what brought these cases to court in the first place have been erased. And all you have are usually 1, 2, or 3 very, precise points of law. I should add that in that court report, Mansfield's decision, murder is mentioned only once, and only in the context of one of the solicitors, one of the barristers mentions murder, but murder is not possible because this was property. So having studied law and understanding this process, I was convinced that all the stories of all the people on board that ship were locked in that 2-page document. So the first phase was, as I said last week, I was going to lock myself in the text in the same way the Africans were locked in the hold of the ship. There are 500 plus different words. and I'm going quickly now. The first part of Zong, which is called os, bone, comprises the words as they are used in that court report, Gregson versus Gilbert. It took me a couple of years. I kept feeling this urge to, as I describe it, break and enter the text. And because I'd set myself this rule, I was only going to use those words, I somehow felt I was cheating to then break that rule. Anyway, I did do it, and as I said, it's like a grand boggle game. The text explodes. I made these dictionaries, so I would take each word, each different word from the text, and find words within those words. And what is interesting is how the poem then wrote itself. In the margins of those dictionaries, words begin to sort of come together, coalesce together, and I begin almost like skimming them off the surface of the page. And that's how the text gets written. It's why I say that I almost abstain from authorial intent in this work. And it has a very important result because, as I mentioned last week, a white male European voice surfaced in the text in terms of the way I was writing it. And I really had a struggle over the years, like I didn't want that voice in there, and I won't, you can ask me in question time for the reasons, but I just felt it shouldn't be there. But because of the way the text was writing itself, it had to stay in the text. What revealed itself to me by the end of the work was that whether he's a captain, a first mate, or what, realizes that he has crossed a line somehow, and that his own redemption depends on him joining his victims. And so he jumps overboard after one of the enslaved Africans jumps overboard. And I think it taught me a lot of humility, because had I sort of maintained the sense of, well, I don't want this in my text, I think I wouldn't have been given, and I think it's a gift in the sense that I think what that act signals is the sense of what he represents, which is a certain way of being in the world has to end for something new to begin. And I consider that something of a gift as a writer. So that was how the text wrote itself. 2 years after it was published, I then, Fred Moten, some of you may know his work. He's an African-American academic. Someone told me about how he was reading Zong, which was he had his class read the whole work together. And as soon as I heard that, because I had been struggling to find a way to read this text, I really had a lot of difficulty. As I had with the second half of She Tries Her Tongue. I remember being at a university and a student saying, would you read Universal Grammar with me? And I heard myself saying, if you read it with me, we can do it. That's when I realized that that's what the work was about. There was something about the polyphonic nature of women's voices that was necessary, and that this text was moving towards more of a choral presentation. And so in Zong, I had a similar struggle. I didn't understand the spaces within the words. I talked about law. There's one governing rule in the 5 sections of Zong that come after os. And that is that no word or cluster of words must come directly below another. They are always seeking the space above. It's as if the words or the clusters of words need space to breathe. Which gets me to this idea of the poetics of breath, which I talked about last week. For me, there's 3 sort of revolving areas I seem to be working with: the poetics of the fragment, the poetics of breath, and the poetics of relation, as in glissade. Because I always sensed in Zong that there was this sense of the other, and what does the other mean? Who is the other? Which gets me to I'm going to wrap up now and I'll repeat something I said last week. One of the questions that confronted me, perhaps the central question in Zong, is being sufficient, or is it contingent? Is it contingent on class, color, race, gender, sexuality. And it seemed to me that those people in the Zong were disposable as the people in Grenfell Towers. You know, that we are still living with this way of considering people disposable, certain groups, certain categories. And so this question, and maybe when I read again at the end, I'll read that particular poem, is. You know, and I think that the liberal humanist tradition attempts to get around some of that, you know, that you have to be Christian or Muslim or to be considered human. But I think that also becomes somewhat warped in the way it develops over a period of time. The last thing I want to say is that what has happened to me in the last few years, ever since that understanding of reading Zong in a group context, is that I've been performing Zong, sometimes with musicians, so we do jazz improv performances, and every year, this will be the 6th year, I hold a collective reading of the entire book, where we begin the book at about 6 or 7 in the evening. And it is made into I provide refreshments in between each section. On one occasion, I actually invited dancers and singers to take sections and do something with it. But we read the entire text through. We usually end somewhere 2 or 3 in the morning. And as I said last week, one of the things that's really quite remarkable, and we were talking before we came in about this, the designated mourners. What is quite remarkable is that you would expect that after reading a text like this that you would be depressed and brought down, but it's quite the contrary. Now, what's interesting and somewhat uncanny, we usually begin maybe with, say, 30 or 40 people. By the end of the evening, there may be 6 or 7, which is an uncanny parallel of the slave journey itself. So there are usually a few of us, and it's important to have drummers or musicians there because you're very tired. The text becomes more difficult as the work goes on, and you're also more tired. So you're trying to strategize, how do I read? Do I read for meaning, or do I just read for sound? And sometimes you find yourself, I have, reading for meaning. Sometimes that becomes too difficult. You just sort of are just reading for sound. And I mean, I've talked with people who've done it, and they have the same issues. Sometimes you find yourself in the earlier part of the text, again, it sometimes sounds like a cacophony, you know. And, you know, we often think cacophony must be quite, it sounds untidy and it must be difficult and problematic. But in that cacophony, there's so many interesting things happen. Sometimes you can hear a voice and you link yourself to that particular voice that helps to carry you along. Voices take on different tonalities in the reading. You can be silent. We've also done it in the darkness. When we start off in the darkness with just little flashlights. What is remarkable about that is that people own the text immediately compared to when they read it in the light. I think something about the darkness offers people maybe a protective covering. And so there's this sense of owning the words. No reading has ever been the same as another reading. And I'll end with saying that when I perform it myself, I said this to Marina, recently I think what is happening is that I said at a talk I gave in the States a few months ago that I out myself when I perform Zong. And what do I mean by that when I say I out myself? There's a sense in which something more than the sum of its parts begins to happen. And I have a sort of conflictual feelings about it. It feels African, and I can talk more about that if there are questions in the sense. And I think it links to the process of colonization that separates us from some of those practices and that has made those practices demonize them, made them sort of not acceptable. my most recent configuration of that is that the work outs me, which is another way of coming at it. I think I'll end there because I'm sure there'll be much more to talk about later on. Thank you very much.
So next, it's my pleasure to welcome my colleague, Matthew Reynolds, who's Professor of English and Comparative Criticism here at Oxford and also Fellow of St Anne's. He's the author of the Poetry of Translation and also of Translation, a very short introduction. And his previous work on translation includes the Penguin anthology Dante in English that he co-authored with Eric Griffiths. He chairs the annual Oxford Weidenfeld Translation Prize and is the author of 2 novels, Designs for a Happy Home and The World Was All Before Them. He's also working, and this is, I think, a theme that's running through these presentations, he's also working with sort of living voices, with living craft, on a project involving Oxford Spires School, where...
which is a long way from the Dreaming Spires.
Which is a long way from the Dreaming Spires.
In East Oxford, down the Cowley Road on the left. Yeah.
And the project explores how creativity kind of comes out of multilingualism, comes out of that rub between languages, and there's an anthology of poems that the students are putting together. So that picks up on this idea of voice and silence that NourbeSe touched on. So Matthew, you're very welcome.
Thanks. I've been asked to say something about language and translation. I'm not going to speak with any kind of authority, but just as a reader and admirer of NourbeSe's work, which means as someone whose sense of my own use of language has been challenged, disrupted and expanded by the encounter with the work of NourbeSe. So that the work of using my language to talk about her language, or talk it over, is not straightforward. Instead, I'll try to do something more like talking with or talking under. In Harriet's Daughter, a compelling and much read young adult novel which NourbeSe published in 1983, a girl who's grown up speaking standard Canadian English meets a girl who's just arrived from Tobago and speaks a differently textured and differently sounding language, Tobago talk. Her talk, the girl says, had all these hills and valleys, nothing like my flat, old, boring Canadian talk. Now, if anything's flatter than standard Canadian English, it must be standard English spoken in received pronunciation. And if anything's flatter than standard English, it must be Oxford English, the dialect I am myself condemned to speak most of the time, and obviously I'm using now. In Harriet's Daughter, the Canadian-speaking girl starts learning Tobago talk from her new friend at the same time as her new friend is learning standard Canadian in school. And it's the same kind of desire to dislodge and stretch my own discourse that the encounter with NourbeSe's work creates in me. In the Notanda at the end of Zong, NourbeSe writes that even when we believe we have freedom to use whatever words we wish to use, as I might feel speaking here now, in fact I don't, but I might, much of the language we work with is already pre-selected and limited by fashion, by cultural norms, by systems that shape us, such as gender and race, by what's acceptable. And standing at this podium, I do feel a particular set of cultural norms bearing in on me. And I'm going to deal with them by speaking mainly in the genres of personal response and indeed quotation, and by being brief. So as NourbeSe was describing just now much better than obviously I could, Zong starts from the language of the legal judgment that was handed down in the case about the massacre. And as a way of starting the process of composition, NourbeSe decided to lock herself into the text in the same way as men, women and children were locked in the holds of the slave ship Zong. In the process of breaking that hold, of breaking up this language which promulgated the non-being of African peoples, murdering the text, literally cutting it into pieces, she creates a poetry of disorder and mayhem through which the story which cannot be told can be released. Now, this mayhem is a mixture of different languages, different tongues. Among the mayhem of Zong are words in Yoruba, Spanish, Latin, Shona, Portuguese, West African patois, Hebrew, Greek, Italian, French, Fon, Dutch, and Arabic. It's a counterblast to the language policy of the slave owners as recorded in Edict 1 of Discourse on the Logic of Language, which NourbeSe just read out, with its injunction that the owner of slaves will ensure that the slaves belong to different ethno-linguistic groups so that they can't understand each other and so cannot then foment rebellion and revolution. In Zong, the words do speak to one another, and a memorial rebellion, a monumental revolution is created. NourbeSe writes of the later poems in Zong as translating the earlier ones, and her work has a probing continual connection to translation. So the title of the book, She Tries Her Tongue, Her Silence Softly Breaks, comes from Io, as we heard. And poems in the volume take epigraphs from Ovid's Metamorphoses, as translated by Mary M. Innes, and by Dryden. All things are altered, nothing is destroyed, writes Dryden, translating Ovid, and thereby embodying his point, or is it Ovid's point, in his own words, whose words, which present translation as a form of metamorphosis. Now, people tend to think of translation as something that happens between separate standard languages, say French and English. Translations can be marked as right or wrong. The more fluent they are, i.e. the more they conform to standard norms, the better. But in fact, languages are not separate in themselves. What separates them is politics, institutions of state, education, and law. Language is a continuum which gathers into communities of practice, whose borderlands are porous and which are ever shifting. Translation then can mix kinds of language and change them. NourbeSe quotes Sir Thomas Elyot from back in the 16th century, describing the metamorphosis of Latin words into English, the augmentation of the language, as he called it, which he, with a group of other scholars, was promoting. I intend to augment our English tongue, whereby men should as well express more abundantly the thing that they conceived in their hearts, wherefore language was ordained, having words apt for the purpose. NourbeSe adds that the African needed to express more abundantly the thing they conceived in their hearts is undisputed. That the English language lacked words apt for the purpose cannot be denied. This expression is a matter of using the language in such a way that the historical realities are not erased or obliterated, so that English is revealed as the tainted tongue it truly is, and of trying to engender by some alchemical practice a metamorphosis within the language from father tongue to mother tongue. The making of poetry begins in the body and ends in the body, NourbeSe quotes from Stanley Burnshaw. The word tongue shows this, in particular the horrifying punishment of the tongue outlined in Edict 2 on the photocopy. In Harriet's Daughter, we can see how bodies are continuous with language. There's a scene in which the young girl says something important to an adult, and her whole body listened to what I had to say. And then the adult says something difficult to the child, reliving an old grief. Her body had collapsed into itself. She looked like she didn't have any bones. NourbeSe's poems, as we've just heard, are performable and performed physically. But reading them, just holding the book and reading it, also involves our bodies as well as our minds. As you have to turn your hands or your head to read Discourse on the Logic of Language, as we did, turning the book in the way the mother turns the newborn child. Reading the scattered and fragmented words of Zong, you become aware of the movement of your eyes and tongue. You can scan the words like a coast guard looking at a satellite image of the Mediterranean, waiting for meaning to leap out at you. You can step carefully from word to word. You can find jolts and rhythms sounding from the page and find yourself mouthing them. You can feel your shoulders, your torso beginning to weave from side to side as you follow the zigzag slippages and surges of the words. In her essay on the Toronto Carnival, Caribana, NourbeSe puts slavery in the context of a general European disposition to control movement. Reading her poetry, you develop a disposition to move. Thanks, that's what I had to say.
It's again a very great pleasure for us to host Marina Warner here today. She is Professor of English and Creative Writing at Birkbeck College, as well as Professorial Research Fellow at SOAS, the School of Oriental and African Studies in London. She's a very, very prolific, engaging writer of fiction and cultural history. She's published extensively on myth and fairy tale and storytelling. I'm sure we're all very familiar with this work, from the 1976 book Alone of All Her Sex through to the 2014 Once Upon a Time, a short history of fairy tale, and then also the, to me, wonderful, it's my favorite, Stranger Magic, Charmed Tales, and the Arabian Nights, which won many awards. In fiction, her novels include the book is shortlisted The Lost Father, so like Matthew, she combines critical and cultural and historical and creative writing. And a selection of her new essays on art, Seeing Feelingly, will be published in 2018. Marina is also involved in a really fascinating project called Stories in Transit, in which she's working with refugees in Sicily, young refugees under 18, collecting their stories, gathering their stories, not stories about their harrowing experience of crossing the Mediterranean in boats, but stories that they enjoy. So, and it's about storytelling that I think you're going to speak now.
Thanks very much, Elleke, and wonderful to hear you, NourbeSe.
Thank you.
And Matthew, you're brilliantly brief, as well as cogent. One of the things about literature is that it actually makes the past appear. Archaeology, when there is no text, it becomes extremely difficult to read. So, for example, Stonehenge is kind of mute. There are many, many theories, some of them very convincing, but there is no text that we have. There are no voices that are on the page for us to learn what Stonehenge meant to the people who built it. And that's similar in some very, very remarkable monuments in the world. For example, the Nazca lines in southern Peru, which I'm sure some of you have seen, these tremendous, colossal geoglyphs. There's a huge amount of speculation, historical research, attempts to understand. But given the absence of the human memory, it is very difficult for us to understand what the past was. So one of the things that stories are, written down stories, they are testimony. They form a kind of archive. And that archive does not necessarily mean that it is the actual record of events. It is also the record of people's thought, people's imagination. Now, we had this title, At Home, and that made me feel, what is the relationship between stories and home? And I think this is where the relationship most deeply lies. It lies not so much in the record of what has actually happened, but what has been imagined and passed on. So it lies in one of the main documents of the mother tongue, and that is song. We have songs that were carried on the voices of women, very much mother tongue voices. Lullabies, the world over, a form of very, very deep, very perhaps simple sounding words, but nevertheless the first place of language. And that those little songs sometimes mean nothing, they're just nonsense or syllables. Sometimes they actually tell a story, and that story is connected to the imaginary memory of the group, of the society. One of the things that has happened, as NourbeSe's work wonderfully shows, is that we are surrounded by silence. The enormous territory of the past is largely silent. And one of the tasks that writers have given themselves over time is to call out from that silence some echo that they can catch. And this is now just a kind of a little digression, but my generation were very interested in excavating women's voices. So there was a tremendous, beginning in the 70s and 80s, tremendous excavation of manuscripts, forgotten poets and so forth, and some now are very well known, but literally when I was first an undergraduate, there was barely a woman writer on the curriculum who wasn't Jane Austen in English. I don't know about other languages. Certainly in French, which is what I studied, in Italian, very, very, very rare to have a woman writer. And the other day I was in the Warburg researching something, and I actually found a painting of a woman writing. And I realized that I have actually never seen, I've seen many paintings of women reading, often the Madonna, but I have never seen a Renaissance painting of a woman writing. So here she is. And I mean, this is just to remind you of the rarity of this kind of testimony. So women's voices, black voices, the voices of slaves, the voices of the category called subaltern, has become one of the chief echo chambers where we are trying to recall what we. It's interesting, of course, that the artist. There are many, many examples of this female half-length portraits. Not all of them writing, some of them playing music, is unknown, of course. As he or she was interested in women, that becomes submerged as well. So, so one of the tasks, apart from the historical record that people like Peter Dronka, who wrote a marvelous book on women writers of the Middle Ages, excavated many people who had been lost, one of the tasks has been to, in a sense, create a body of these voices. And NourbeSe's work, when I first came across it, this wonderful poem Zong, seemed to me to be this kind of symphonic cantata of these voices reverberating out of the silence, just magnificently. And Agualusa, who's an Angolan writer, was asked about his historical novels that he writes about Angola. And he said, well, we know almost nothing about our pasts. So the interviewer then put a question to him. Do you think a made-up past can come to define someone's future too? And Agualusa replied, yes, no doubt about it. By making up a past, you're able to alter your future. So the idea that stories, imaginative stories, actually institute a reality while capturing what might have been a reality. They are actually speaking to the present to constitute what Bruce Robbins, who's a comparatist, has called a community of fate. So the stories bring people together with an imaginary memory they share through the story. And this constitutes, or can constitute, a community of fate. Well, one of the things that I think NourbeSe has done so remarkably is turn the Zong story, which was known possibly in academic circles and in other ways too. I mean, there are some other responses, but and this, of course, is one of the earliest responses, which was its Turner's painting called "Slavers Throwing Overboard the Dead and Dying, Typhoon Coming On," which was exhibited at the Royal Academy in 1840 and was bought by John Ruskin, and John Ruskin hung it at the foot of his bed. So this episode, I would say, is a constitutive story of a community of fate, which has actually changed the way at the time that people thought about slavery. It was so disgusting that a man should claim insurance on somebody he'd murdered because he said it was goods that he'd lost overboard. This was just so repellent, so deeply repugnant to everything we consider human, that it has actually become a wonderful phrase you use, a tombstone that speaks. And I think that's where you also brought in this analogy with Grenfell. You know, the Grenfell is a tombstone that speaks. This is now a constitutive story of our community of fate. The other way that NourbeSe has very much looked at the silence of the past is actually to try and draw out entanglements. The Zong massacre, though you say that you've heard some of the white voices that are feeling guilty too, you've heard that as well. But nevertheless, there's a way in which the underside of certain past encounters has been also brought into her work. And this is from 7 Stations of the Harmattan, which is a collaborative work with Omar Berada, who's a Moroccan-American now. He lives in Brooklyn, and a very fine poet and translator himself. And he and NourbeSe together have written this, and I think it's still in progress, is that right? Yes. Harmattan is the northeasterly wind that blows in the winter in North Africa. And so there's a kind of sense also in Zong of how weather is metaphorical. And he was the ambassador sent by Morocco to Queen Elizabeth I. And we have this portrait, it's in Birmingham. And this is one of the poems which we can look at afterwards, because I think we haven't got time now. But this is the text of the document that was written by the ruler, the King of Barbary, a real person. He sounds like a character in Shakespeare, but he's a real person. Sent this ambassador to make a deal with the British against the Spanish. And this is, of course, sort of kind of forgotten story, but it's an archival story, historical story. And so that's one method. And then the other method that NourbeSe and Omar together have adopted for their collaboration continues the work of the Zong. And this very shocking photograph shows you the border in Tangier with the people attempting to cross into, I imagine, Europe. Is this Ceuta? Is it Ceuta? Yes, Ceuta is mainland Africa, but is Europe. It belongs to Spain. And it's a very, very old, originally from the slave trade citadel on the North African shore. And in a very good book called The Uninvited, Jeremy Harding wrote that you could tell who had come across the border of Ceuta because their hands were all scarred with the barbed wire, the razor wire on the top of the fence. And here you see them attempting to enter Europe into the golf course, the luxury golf course on the other side, where people are playing silently. I mean, people are not listening, deaf to what they see. So, and then the third point I wanted to make is that while there is an issue of writing and who learns to write, as well as who learns to speak the language, I think one of the ways that the communities of fate are being put together now in a very hopeful way, and that is these kinds of assembly performances. And the oral project that I'm involved in, and that I think you're involved in too, it's not only oral, but the idea is to try and get the music of language working in groups. And then you can commit it to paper later if you want to. But the idea that the work of exchanging stories, of communicating when you have been disassembled and scattered and brought together as refugees in another place, that work can be done better in groups rather than in the tradition of silent reading and silent writing on the page alone. So there has been quite a strong trend, I think, along many different social vectors towards returning to what I call assembly, a form of secular ritual in which people attempt to touch one another again and turn themselves into some kind of common holding story, territory of story. Thank you.
I was particularly struck from where I'm sitting by the role that silence played. Silence as a theme, silence as a presence, silence as the silence of unbeing, silence as death and as punishment, but also as a very sort of potentially creative space, a space of potential and new life. Throughout what you were reading, and then also in some of the responses that Matthew and Marina gave. So without silence, we don't have language. We don't have the space between the words. A breath is audible, but it's also in a way a silence. It's a moment when also the listener can come in and pause and take stock. So I was just very very struck by that. But that's just by way of opener. I wonder, NourbeSe, if you would like to respond to the images or the thoughts that Matthew and Marina offered.
Well, I think what you're saying is so important, because one of the things I've said is that it is the spaces in the text of Zong that are driving the text, and the most important things that are happening in those spaces, and those spaces are blank spaces. But I really sense as a poet that is where something very significant is happening. And I had to learn, and I'm still in the process of learning. There was a time when I don't have it in this book, but I actually was scoring them like rests in music, you know, and counting out how many beats to keep each space and so on. So it is a continuing interaction with those spaces. And yes, I think the silence can be very generative. And the fragment works with the silence, because the fragment is a part of the larger whole. So that's really important. I think one of the things I just wanted to say in response, or that I had hoped to say before, when I was doing the last section of Zong, and it was something I think Matthew said that brought this to mind. And I said this last week, Marina. I really felt, you know, as the text proceeds, the text is degrading, it's degenerating and becoming more and more fragmented. And it was when I was doing that last section, Ferum, that I really had the sense, and it came to me, I didn't set out with this feeling, that I was having my revenge on the English language, in the sense that for the first time, in response to that poem, What is My Mother Tongue, I felt that I had found my tongue. And in typing, inputting what we do on computers now, those fragments, those grunts, those moans, those pieces of words, that was in fact my language. And so that's what I mean when I say that. Now, when I read it, what I think, I don't know if when people read it as a regular written text, when I read it out loud, often I hear another language under the language as it appears on the page. I can hear conversations of people. So it's as if underneath this broken, fragmented English, not sits because it's more alive than just sitting. There is this other, or these other languages continually reinventing themselves. Yeah.
Can I ask about the word murder and the word mother, which are quite close, and especially when that sequence of pronunciations of mother that you've got in that poem. And I was really struck at the end in your description of the writing process of Zong, where you say you're locked in the legal language and you're breaking out of it, and then you suddenly say, I wanted to, it's a really violent bit when you're describing your own process, I wanted to murder the language, you say. And because that's so much a switching round of the, you know, it's a revenge, or it's a switching of position from the person doing, you know, speaking on behalf of people who've had violence done to them, to being in the position of someone who's doing a metaphorical violence. I just wondered about that.
So,
strong.
You know, I think it's, you know, Kamau Brathwaite, the Caribbean poet, talks about the way we speak. We don't speak in iambic pentameters, we from the Caribbean. We speak, our speech is like a machine gun. And I think that because, interrupt myself, this work, to me, what made it unreadable, even for myself initially, was that there are these massive interruptions that are happening, different discourses. There's the only positive thing that's happening in discourse is the mother blowing words into her daughter's mouth. And you have to make an effort, as you said, to read that story. But the negative stuff doesn't disappear. It just becomes unreadable while you occupy that space where something generative is happening. So you have these massive interruptions that, you know, where the First Nations discourse is interrupted fatally often in the Caribbean. The African discourse, the European, and it's like these tectonic plates of language and culture are driving against each other, which is very violent. And it seemed to me that, I think you talk about murder and mother and so on, that what fascinated me as I got deeper into the text of Zong is that how one set of letters could mean one thing in one language and something else in another language, which gets to your point about translation not being so hived off. But to come back to your question about revenge, you know, there is this, as I walk around Oxford, I'll share this, you know, it's so beautiful, and it's, you know, the history of it, you know. And at times I feel this pain in my heart because I feel, oh, there's so much that was lost and will never be replaced. So there's always this, you know, I'm always balancing this, these feelings of being able to appreciate the beauty here, but there's so much barbarism behind it.
Yeah.
I don't know if that
And
answers your question.
there's a particular campaign at the moment about trying to restore some of the obliterated memories of the history of Oxford's capital, really.
I'm going to reverse a little bit and go into the gaps, the silences. Because recently friends of ours have taken an interest in the Quakers, and a most wonderful book I read was by a chap called Fuchs, who was here at the Department of Education in the 60s, and I still have this book. It's entitled The Quakers, and it's amazing because it's been printed with batches of 3-4 pages, nothing printed on them.
Yeah.
There was, if you like, I know God works in mysterious ways, but I don't think it, well, it may have been deliberate, but it just speaks really for Quakerism, the silences on those books. And I thought perhaps there was a slight parallel with
I think that's very important what you're saying, and it goes back to what I was saying. I think the silences in this text are the most important parts of the text and are what is driving the text.
But you're interested in the kind of paralinguistic things that are not quite silent, aren't you? You're talking, I mean, you have some wonderful lines about moan and babble and grunt and whimper. All these ways of speaking without words.
Without words as well.
And
yes.
of course, one of the people who was very interested in that as well is Beckett, who changed his language on purpose. I mean, he wanted to have less language. He said that. He wanted to get away from flowery, you know, Blarney, which he had command of, into French, which he didn't know very well, in order to arrive at what he called the vociferations, at a sort of grunting, a language that was at the level of the grunt or the groan, and that your silent, your gaps, I think, are not quite silent. I mean, they're the place where the inarticulacy of deep feeling happens. You know, and this is a common language. I mean, we could probably understand, you know, people from Tierra del Fuego when they groan.
What I would say, Marina, is that silence is never silent. You know, like there's always something underneath. So I entirely agree with you in terms of that. And it's, I mean, I think of the first poem. Wow. That fades away, but is still echoing in that silence. And I think that is maybe what it is you're trying, like you're getting at in terms of. I mean, Marconi argued, I think I mentioned it in the essay, that in water sound never dies. So if that is in fact the case, then all the voices of these people are actually trapped underwater. So there is in fact no silence. But the silence is really speaking.
En français, nous disons La parole est d'argent, mais le silence est d'or.
Je comprends.
Silence is golden. There's a question at the back, please. Thank you.
More of a something to speak to along these lines, because you mentioned, well, have you mentioned Quakerism, and then you basically mentioned earlier Zen, thinking of things like meditation and sitting in silence with the Quakers, and you having a lot of white space on the page. It seems like it's a need to create space in order for much more to rise up. And what you mentioned of these other conversations or other voices happening underneath the words, I think is very interesting. It makes me think of haunting, kind of being haunted, learning to try to bring those ideas together.
There's also a really important aspect of Zong, which is which I was very struck and moved by, is the names of the tribes, the tribes who were transported, as here running along the bottom of the page, all the way along as a sort of as a flow, as a continuum, which again is not a silence at all. It's a sort of it's a susurration below the surface, isn't it? I was thinking what you were just saying about the sea.
Yes, and how often when the students often do this when they read it, they forget to read those names there, which is very much what what Zong was all about. Who's forgotten, who's disposable, who are the footnotes. And in terms of what you were saying, Kelly, what I say in the Notanda, which I hadn't intended to be part of the work, I should explain that. I always keep journals when I write, and so I was working out the ideas, and I sent that to the press, because they have a very complicated way of assessing manuscripts, and they wanted to keep it in, and I was concerned that it might be somewhat prescriptive, but because it was being used for universities, they felt very strongly that it should be in there. But one of the things I say in there is that it's a hauntological work. So there is a haunting that is going on. And I think it gets back to this, who is the designated mourner? Who mourns for people who haven't been mourned for? And I think that is actually very important work to do. And I think poets have done that traditionally. Other people in different communities and so on, but perhaps we talked about Grenfell and who are the designated mourners for that place. And so for me, coming from the new old world, I call it, because it was an old world, but for us it was a new world. It's where there's been so much loss and loss upon loss. It's very important to do this work of, it's almost a sort of spiritual archaeological work. Marina, you talked about the silence and not knowing and not having the stories and the songs and so on. And, I think that in the Caribbean in particular, where the indigenous people have been virtually erased, so it's not even like Canada or Australia, where you still have those people there with their own stories and so on. And Glissant touches on this in his work, in terms of, is it possible to make ourselves autochthonous to that land? But even that doesn't make sense, because to be autochthonous is to be off the land, but we're not off the land. So how does one begin to belong to those places that one did not have a choice in being? And so it has many reverberations. So what's happening today, nomads, people who are traveling, people who are going to other lands because they have to go to other lands, how do they make them home? Should we make them home? Are they ever home? Yeah, those are some of the reverberations for me in this text. I think this gentleman has his hand up before this.
Yeah, on that note, I find it so fascinating how your poem discourses on the logic of language speaks to home and belonging, and as a non-native English speaker, I identify a lot with the poem. And I found a word there that that I hadn't quite looked like that before. So I'm German, and in German the translation for native country is fatherland. So we have the fatherland and the mother language. And I found this so fascinating because I hadn't quite realized that before I read your poem, how in this plays with this idea of gender. And I was wondering, well, the motherland and father country, what happens if these are different, or if mother and father then have different origins? So I found it, thank you so much for reading that.
I'd like to gather questions in a cluster. So that I saw there's a question back, and then this lady had a question.
Well, a question for Marina. I was very taken by the orality and communality of your work with the Sicilian refugees. And I just wondered about how this meshes with the silence that they may have experienced in their journeys, which might have been quite traumatic, and whether something of that has come through in their discussions and stories.
Sorry, Marina, I'm just gathering.
Thank you all for the enlightening discussion. We had a collective reading of some of Zong in Nairobi in Kenya, and the context in Kenya is that we live with 44 languages. And so our experience as we were reading Zong was very much of the conversations floating up. Everybody really felt the words rising as we were reading. And one of the things that I'm fascinated by when you talk about, you briefly mentioned polyphony, was your process around the different voices and the waiting and kind of how those voices work through the silence and how you work with them as a writer when there are so many voices.
Let's just keep it to. Oh, is it Tessa? Is just voices we haven't heard.
Just very quickly say what an honour it is to see you in person, because I first studied you at graduate school in 2000, and it brings back all that excitement. So thank you very much for coming. And my quick question was, do you have a conscious connection between Zong and Melville's story Benito Sereno, where you have all these legal depositions and pages of words, and then Nikki spoke about who, when he's asked to speak about what was his role in this mutiny, is a very powerful silence, and because he won't speak, he can't but be drawn or convicted as he might have been had he tried to speak.
Okay. Marina, would you like to speak to that question?
No, I think it's fine. I think obviously
yeah.
should answer the. I mean, I'll comment later if there's time. But you answer first.
I just wanted to go back to something Marina said about Beckett and French. One of the things that I have always felt for the longest while, when I work with English, it's as if I work with a foreign language. I never take anything for granted. It creates a lot of tension, but it's a tension that can be quite generative as well. But in terms of your question and about reading Zong in Kenya, which moves me deeply. When I go to Africa, I've been there a few times, those moments are when I understand the loss, when I hear the different mother tongues being spoken, different tongues being spoken, it strikes me, or very much again, how deep that loss goes. One of the things I say is that as displaced peoples, like we have had to improvise from the beginning, from the slave coffle onto the slave ship. So there's always this sense of improvising. African Americans talk about making a way out of no way and so on. So there are all these ways that that has led to tremendous creativity in this new old world, in places of extreme deprivation. To the question about mother tongue and father tongue, you know, one of the challenges for me is that the two sources of my love of English, the Book of Common Prayer, because I was raised Anglican, And I really loved it. And the Calypsonians, you know. And what I say is that I cannot pretend. It's like having an abusive parent. You can't pretend the parent doesn't exist, you know. And many people, we know that from reports, from literature, that even though a parent may have abused you, you continue to love that parent. The child continues to love that parent. So that is the contradiction that one balances on. English is my mother tongue, is my father tongue, is a foreign language. You know, so it's one of those things that one has to somehow embrace and work with. It's orality. Someone asked Marina about orality. What is interesting for me is that Zong has moved to orality now. And I don't know if I was telling you, Marina, that I was exploring, because I feel that I'm tied to the book, but when I perform it, it moves into orality. So I actually experimented with tying the book to myself in certain performances to see what would happen. And it's still something that I am exploring. You know, I'll share this story with you. So, you know, we talk about fragmentation and postmodernism, and for the longest while I understood this to be a work coming out of that tradition. Modernism. I came across something about 2 years ago, some work by English woman Karen Barber. Does anyone know her work? She's done a lot of work on Oriki.
James has published her.
Oh wow! I've been
sitting there and saying,
I sent her an email and she responded to me and so on. The work I'm thinking, I could sing all night. It's one about the women who sing Oriki in Nigeria. And Oriki, if I say praise song, I'm not doing it justice, because you can have Oriki at weddings and so on. But when I read her description of Oriki, which are fragments, it really was a moment when I was so struck by how much this resonates with an Oriki type of practice. And so I wrote to her and I sent her a copy of the book and so on, and I actually wrote to ask if she had any videos of some of these women singing Oriki. So that was another moment of revelation for me, that it in no way discounts that this is coming out of the modernist tradition, but there is also this other aspect to it that I am exploring and seeing how it fits in to an aesthetic, a Yoruba aesthetic, that is also quite fascinating. Yeah.
In the interest of time, I can't believe how the time has flown. I'm going to move to a close because we're going to invite NourbeSe to give a final reading, I think, from Zong itself. I would just like to take Chair's prerogative and ask a question about readership stroke audience. NourbeSe, so I'm interested in whether you sort of scoring a piece almost as a musical performance, or whether you're writing something that is much more, if you like, text-based. How aware you are of sort of casting your voice across to an audience, or of interacting with a listener or a reader? I wonder if that is something that I'm assuming from what you've been saying that it's almost something that is as natural as breathing in your work, that sort of that give and take with a listener or respondent. But I just thought I'd ask the question by way of closing.
How aware I am of
that community, that group, that single person who will listen, who will receive the work, as these listeners have received it already.
I can't say that I am overly aware that there is a particular reader that I have in mind, or that I'm necessarily aiming the work towards. apart from those two voices behind me there. This work, I felt if there was any audience I had in mind, and this may not land in the way it should here, it was actually the ancestors that I was very conscious of when I was, and I don't even understand what I mean by that, but it felt like it was being. So there was a moment when the work was first done, the first publication, when they sent me the proofs, it was a narrower book. And everything just felt very cramped. And I said, no, I couldn't agree to that. And so it was sent back, and this size. But it took such a long time. I remember feeling almost at the end of my resources. And then I had this thought, oh, but it has taken more than 200 years for these voices to be heard. What's another month? Mm-hmm. Like that in fact, I remember that moment very, very clearly. So I'm not sure it's a satisfactory answer, but I was very aware of something, talking to that silence, to that history, that there was something going on there. One other quick story about publication. The publishers wanted me to cut the work by 25%. This was before it was in this form. It was written in a more conventional, way that poetry tends to be written. I couldn't see how to do it. I consulted with a colleague. She said you would lose quite a bit of what was important. Then I went to Ghana. I did a summer course there. I felt I had to ask permission, and I think that's a really important concept. We won't talk much about it now. It may seem odd, because we've had a lot of arguments in Canada about appropriation of voice and so on. And I think part of that discussion has to do with permission. And it may seem odd to say that I felt I needed permission, but I felt I needed permission to bring these voices forward. And so I met with a friend in Ghana, and we spoke to a traditional priest about it and so on. I came back to Canada not knowing what I was going to do with this text. I went to a friend's farmhouse, and then suddenly I had this idea of spread the text out, and it solved the problem of length, So there were these serendipitous things that would happen, in the text that almost sort of was running parallel to my consciously working on it. So I don't know if that answers your question, but it's the most honest way of trying to deal with what you're asking.
It answers my question.
In terms of Moby Dick, there was no not Moby Dick. There was no conscious reference to that. Zong number 4. This is, not was, or should be. This be, not, should be. This should, not, be, is. Lepapwiche, Aziza, Chipo, Dada, Nomsa. Zong number 7. First, the when, the which, the who, the were, the throwing overboard, the be, come, apprehended, exist, did not. Wemusa, Ilesanmi, Nayo, Odai. Defend the dead, wait
of circumstance, ground to usual and etc., where the ratio of just in less than is necessary to murder, the subject in property, the save in underwriter, where etc. tunes justice, and the ratio of murder is the usual in occurred. Aquila, Falope, Ouma, Weke, Jubade. The just in ration, the suffer in loss, defend the dead, the wait in circumstance, act in necessary, the ration in just, age the act in the our way to justice. Masire, Ndale, Omounmi, Ramla, Ajani. I'm going to read just from this last section here, and I will. I saw the way Ray all stand, ding on deck his cape is to ring it. Must be so. There is ska, end of muss. Cough Negroes, where? Stapin. Tipot of alle sin, go for me an aria of the asp oracle, of hope lord and serf master, the slave god, and man you and I all, meet in the know, day that is his. Hip declare I, gnaw this tale I must, recite all, the same they suffered, oh me oh, me oh, me oh my go, Dio, me water if I can if, oh me oh, me oh, me oh my go, do, me water if I can if I can, if only if I can all, that remain, oh me oh, me oh, me oh my go, do, me water if I can if I can, if only if I can all, that rema in Zare, words I do not owe. Date. Oh me oh, me oh, me oh my God, oh, me water if I can if I can, if only if I can all that remain in array, words I do not all. Read water, then they sin, kun dare the way out of men's our ways suffered. Oh me oh, me oh, me oh my go, oh me oh, me oh my go, oh me oh, me oh, me oh my go, do, oh mio, mio, 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 my God, oh mio, mio, oh mio, mio, my God, oh mio, 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 mio, my God, oh mio, oh mio, oh mio, mio, my God, oh mio, oh mio, oh mio, oh mio, oh mio, oh mio, Thank you.